It was supposed to be a simple backpacking trip. I had found a route in the Cascades National Park, a 6-day, out-and-back trail that promised incredible views and a remote wilderness experience. I didn't know much about the trail itself, but I wasn't concerned. I enjoyed the solitude that came with these long treks, knowing I'd likely not run into too many people along the way. By the third day, I had made some good progress. The trail was tough, but the views were worth it. Around mid-afternoon, I came across a small campsite and spotted another hiker sitting by his tent. He looked to be in his mid-30s, just relaxing as the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees. We struck up a casual conversation. He told me he was planning to stay there for the night and head up to the peak tomorrow. I mentioned that I was continuing to the same peak today and joked that I might see him up there the next day. After chatting for a while, I said my goodbyes and kept moving. The trail took me higher, and by late afternoon I had reached my destination. A stunning lookout at the peak. I set up camp, ready to enjoy a rest day and soak in the incredible views. That night, no one else came through. I figured I had the place all to myself, which was a little eerie but also peaceful. As I lay in my tent, I couldn't help but think of that guy I met back at the other campsite. He'd said he'd be here today, but he never showed. Maybe he decided to rest another day at his campsite or changed his plans altogether. It wasn't unusual for people to adjust their hikes depending on how they felt. The next morning, I packed up and started my descent back down the trail. I had a late start and was moving slower than usual. My legs ached from the previous days of hiking, and it felt like the trail was endless. As nightfall crept in, I found myself relying on my headlamp to light the way. I had hoped to reach the campsite where I had met that man, but darkness came quicker than expected. Finally, after what seemed like hours of walking in the dark, I reached the site. His tent was still there, exactly where I'd seen it 2 days earlier, but something was off. The tent was still set up, but there was no sign of the man. I called out asking if he was all right, but the only answer was the silence of the forest. I stepped closer, hesitating before peeking inside the partially open tent flap. It was empty, no sleeping bag, no gear, just an empty shell, like he had never returned. A cold chill ran through me. Something wasn't right. As I stood there, scanning the area, my eyes caught a faint flicker of light in the distance. A headlamp, maybe 40 yards out, barely glowing in the dark. It was so dim, I figured the batteries were almost dead. Curious but cautious, I walked toward the light, keeping my footsteps soft. When I reached the source, I found the headlamp lying on the ground, still flickering. It looked like it had been dropped. Suddenly, I felt that unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. I looked up and froze. There, standing just 10 yards away, was a figure, motionless, watching me from the shadows. The outline was faint, but I could tell they were trying not to be seen. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized this wasn't the man I had met earlier. Something about this person felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't help but try to break the silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Do you need help?" No response. The figure stood perfectly still, like a statue in the dark. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Without waiting for an answer, I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. I didn't dare turn my back on them. As I reached the tent, I quickly grabbed my pack, not bothering to unpack anything. Then as I started to leave, I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over me. The headlamp in the woods, it had gone out. I didn't stop. I hiked through the night, my adrenaline pushing me forward, refusing to look back. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig had me on edge, convinced that figure was following me. Finally, after 3 grueling miles, I made it to the next campsite. I collapsed in my tent, shaken but relieved to be farther away from whatever, or whoever, that was. The next morning, I reported what happened to the rangers. They took it seriously and began a search. As it turned out, the man I had met earlier had gone missing. His belongings were still at the campsite, but there was no sign of him. There were no clues, no footprints, no trail to follow. In the vast expanse of the Cascades, searching for someone was nearly impossible. The man was never found. And as for the figure I saw that night, no one knows who or what it was. But deep down, I have a feeling it had something to do with the man's disappearance. What happened out there remains one of the greatest unknowns of my life. I had booked an Airbnb several weeks in advance for a quick business trip. It was in a town I'd never visited, and I was only staying for one night. The plan was simple: meet with a client, stay the night, and drive back home the next day. The drive was about 3 hours, and when I finally arrived, the neighborhood seemed off. It was eerily quiet. Most of the houses had their lights off, and thick trees covered the lawns, making everything feel hidden, as if the area was trying to keep something secret. As I pulled into the driveway and stepped out of my car, I noticed someone walking down the street. They were pretty far away, but something about them gave me an uneasy feeling. There was nothing obviously wrong, they were just walking, but still, the atmosphere felt strange. I shook off the feeling, grabbed my bags and headed inside. The Airbnb itself was nothing special, just an ordinary house, clean enough and perfect for what I needed. After checking out the rooms and making sure everything was in order, I stepped back outside to grab my second bag from the car. That's when I saw him again, the same person standing in the road. Only this time they weren't walking anymore. They were just standing there, staring directly at the Airbnb. It was unsettling. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then, as if they noticed me watching, they turned and started walking away again, slowly disappearing down the street. I kept my eyes on them until they were out of sight, my paranoia growing. Was this just a coincidence? I wasn't sure, but it didn't feel right. I quickly grabbed my bag, locked up the house, and even pulled my car into the garage just to be safe. Over the next couple of hours, I found myself checking outside periodically. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there lurking. But every time I checked, the street was empty. Eventually I convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild, and since I had to be up early for my meeting, I decided to head to bed. It was a restless night. I woke up a few times, each time convinced I'd heard something, but everything seemed quiet. Then at 4 a.m. my alarm went off. The sun wasn't up yet, and the house was still wrapped in darkness. Groggy, I sat up in bed, ready to start my day, when something immediately caught my attention. There was a faint light coming from under the bedroom door. I froze. I was certain I had turned off all the lights before going to bed. My mind raced. Had I forgotten one? But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Something wasn't right. I cautiously got out of bed and walked up to the door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard something on the other side. There were soft shuffling sounds like someone moving around at the end of the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened the door a crack and peered into the hallway. The living room light was on. I knew I hadn't left that light on, but more terrifying than the light was what I saw next. There, in the corner of the living room, was a man. He was crouched down, rummaging through one of my bags. He was wearing a black hoodie and ripped jeans, the exact same outfit as the person I had seen walking down the road earlier. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before the man turned to face me. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look startled. It was as if he had been waiting for me, expecting me. He dropped the bag he was holding and took a step toward me, his face twisted into something between a sneer and a grimace. "Stay where you are!" he yelled, his voice cold and threatening. Panic flooded my body. I knew I had only seconds to react. He started moving toward me, and instinct took over. I turned and sprinted back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me just as he reached it. I heard him crash into the door, and then he started kicking at it, trying to force it open. His kicks were relentless, each one louder than the last. Then I heard him fumbling with the lock. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I saw the window. Without thinking, I yanked it open and crawled out into the cold night air. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I dropped down into the bushes and ran. Ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. I was still shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. The officers searched the house and confirmed what I had feared. He had been inside for a while. Not only were my bags missing, but the bedroom door had been picked open. If I had stayed inside trying to hide, who knows what might have happened. The police suspected that this man hadn't just been looking to rob me. There was something far more sinister behind his actions. The way he had watched me from the street, the way he had broken in and waited, it felt like he had planned this. And the most terrifying part? He was still out there somewhere. I can only pray he doesn't find me again. Earlier this spring, I decided to take a camping trip to a small, secluded lake about 4 hours north of where I live. It's a place I'd been to many times before, tucked away in the woods and never crowded. In fact, I don't think many people even know about it. Every time I went, it was the perfect peaceful getaway, a place where I could relax and disconnect from the world. On the first day, everything seemed normal. I set up my tent near the grassy beach that surrounded the lake, feeling completely alone. The lake wasn't too big, and from my spot I could see the entire shoreline. I thought it would just be me there for the weekend, but as the day wore on, I saw a figure emerge from the woods on the opposite side of the lake. A man, carrying a tent. He looked like any other camper, average, with a friendly vibe. I watched as he set up his camp across the lake, keeping to himself for the most part. As the sun began to set though, I noticed him making his way around the lake, heading toward my campsite. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when he arrived, he introduced himself with a friendly smile. "Hey, I'm William," he said, extending his hand. "I saw you across the lake and figured I'd come say hi. This place is usually deserted, so it's cool to see someone else out here." We chatted for a bit and William seemed like a genuinely nice guy. He was 26, around the same age as me, and he liked this camping spot for the same reason I did: its seclusion. We talked for about half an hour before he headed back to his side of the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. It seemed like nothing more than a chance encounter with another camper. The next day, we hung out again. William brought over a 6-pack of beers and we sat on the beach swapping stories and enjoying the peaceful setting. It felt like I'd made a new friend, someone I could potentially camp with again in the future. By the end of the day, I was feeling good about the trip, and after William headed back to his tent, I sat by my small campfire, feeling content. But as night fell, things started to change. I was just about to stomp out the fire and head to bed when I saw William again. He was walking around the lake toward my campsite, but something about him was different. His friendly demeanor seemed off. His smile was still there, but it felt forced, almost eerie. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked as he approached. He nodded, then, almost too casually, said, "I found this cool spot earlier today. You have to see it. The view's amazing, especially at night." I hesitated. It was late, and the idea of wandering through the woods in the dark didn't exactly sound appealing. But William was persistent, saying it was worth it, that I'd regret not seeing it. He hyped it up so much that I felt almost obligated to go. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we started walking along the edge of the lake, heading into the woods on the opposite side. There was no clear path, and the deeper we went, the more uneasy I became. It was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the moon, and the fact that William seemed to know exactly where he was going made me wonder how often he came here. It didn't seem like a spot you just stumble upon. After what felt like 15 minutes of trekking through the dense trees, William slowed down. He pointed ahead, smiling again. "This is it," he said. But when I looked, I didn't see any amazing view. Instead, there was an old, decrepit RV, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. It was rusted, covered in moss, and looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were shattered, and the metal siding was peeling away, exposing the rotting interior. "What is this?" I asked, turning back to William. His expression had completely changed. The friendly, easygoing vibe was gone, replaced by a cold, empty stare. It was like he was a different person altogether. I backed up a step, my heart racing, and that's when I heard it, the rusty door of the RV creaking open behind me. Before I could even process what was happening, another figure darted out of the RV, heading straight for me. I didn't wait to see who it was. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I could hear both William and the other person close behind, their footsteps crunching on the dead leaves and twigs. My mind was racing, terror gripping me as I realized I was being chased, deep in the woods, far from any help. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached, weaving through the trees, hoping to lose them. Eventually, the sounds of their pursuit faded, but I didn't stop. I had no idea where I was, and with no path to follow, I was hopelessly lost. The woods were a disorienting maze in the dark, but I kept moving, knowing I couldn't stay in one place for long. By the time the sun began to rise, I finally recognized the tree line near the lake. I crept back cautiously, peering out from the woods. What I saw made my stomach drop. My entire campsite was gone. All of my gear, my tent, everything. It was as if I had never been there. I didn't wait around to find out what happened. I stayed hidden until I was sure the coast was clear, then made my way back to the trail and headed straight for my car. As soon as I got cell service, I called the police and reported what had happened. They didn't seem to take it seriously though. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. And honestly, I don't think they even tried. Whoever William was, and whatever was planned for me that night, it's terrifying to think about how close I came to finding out firsthand. I can only hope that no one else stumbles across that lake or those woods. It may look peaceful, but something far darker is lurking out there. It was supposed to be a straightforward road trip. Just me, my car, and a few stops along the way. Portland to Chicago, nearly a 3-day drive. I had planned it all out, booking Airbnbs instead of hotels to make the experience a little more personal and less crowded. The first stop was a small, remote town in Wyoming. When I say small, I mean no bigger than 2 or 3 miles long, tucked away in the quiet, snow-covered landscape of the state. As I crossed the Wyoming border, the weather turned. Heavy snow started to fall, slowing my progress. By the time I rolled into town, the roads were completely covered, and night had settled in. The whole place was eerily still, almost abandoned. There were no open restaurants, no familiar fast food chains, just a few dimly lit houses scattered around. Not exactly the lively pit stop I had hoped for, but I wasn't looking for excitement. Just a warm bed to crash in. I turned down the long driveway to my Airbnb. The small house stood alone in a field surrounded by towering pine trees, their branches sagging under the weight of fresh snow. The scene could have been picturesque, but something about the isolation made it feel off. The house was small, about 500 square feet, and simple. Just a living room, bedroom, and a small bathroom. It was all I needed for the night. I punched in the code, stepped inside, and flicked on the lights. Immediately, the house was filled with a soft glow, making it feel a little more welcoming. I dropped my bag near the bed and took a seat on the couch. But as soon as I sat down, a loud thump came from the bedroom. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling or maybe something outside, but it was too loud for that. I slowly walked to the bedroom, my heart pounding, and flipped on the light. The room was empty, the bed undisturbed. I checked the bathroom, nothing. But the closet door caught my eye. It was closed, and when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge, locked from the inside. A chill ran down my spine. Why would a closet in an Airbnb be locked from the inside? My mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe it was a maintenance closet or storage. Trying to shake off the unease, I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, thinking about my next move for the morning. After a few minutes of restless sitting, I got up and peered out the window. The snow was still falling, and the town, what little there was of it, was completely dark. There wasn't a single streetlight or sign of life. I shut the blinds quickly, trying to ignore the growing feeling of isolation. As I turned away from the window, I saw something, a shadow move across the bedroom doorway. It was subtle, almost like the shadow of a door opening or closing. My body tensed. I knew I had just checked the room, but something was moving in there. I approached the bedroom, each step heavy with dread. The door was still open and everything was in the same place as before, except for that closet. It was still closed, but my gut was screaming at me to check it again. I reached for the handle, and this time it opened with ease. It was unlocked. The closet was empty, just a small walk-in space, completely bare. But before I could process what was happening, I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I spun around, and there he was. A man, standing in the doorway to the bathroom. He was huge, his face covered in scratches and cuts, his clothes torn and dirty. He looked like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. But the most unsettling part was his expression, completely devoid of emotion. He didn't seem surprised or angry, just indifferent. He didn't say a word. He stepped further into the room, kneeling down beside the bed and pulling out a filthy duffel bag that had been hidden underneath. My mind raced. Had he been here the whole time? Was he hiding in the closet, watching me? I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, frozen, as he slung the bag over his shoulder and walked out of the room without even glancing at me. I heard the front door open and shut, and then silence. My legs finally unfroze, and I rushed to the window, watching as the man trudged through the snow, disappearing into the darkness beyond the yard. I immediately called the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what had just happened. By the time they arrived, the man was long gone. They checked the house but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had even been there except for me. I left the next morning, but the image of that man haunted me the whole way home. He hadn't seemed like a burglar, he didn't take anything except the duffel bag, and the way he looked at me, or didn't look at me, made my skin crawl. Who was he? Why was he there? I'll never know what he was doing in that house or how long he'd been hiding in the shadows. But one thing is certain. I was lucky that I didn't fall asleep with him lurking just inches away from me, watching, waiting. I still think about that night every time I book an Airbnb, and every time I double-check the closets.